Welcome. If this is your first time here, welcome to our monthly PCMI Payments Industry Coffee Chats. My name is Lindsay Lehr. I'm the Managing Director of PCMI. And I believe this is our fifth year running these meetings. These were born in the pandemic, right? As a way to bring our network together. In April of 2020 was our first coffee chat. And we received such great support and interest that we've kept them going. That's been fantastic. That's all thanks to you guys for showing up week after week. This year, we are reducing our frequency to monthly. That way, hopefully, we can have very impactful sessions, bringing you great content, great speakers on very relevant topics. This is our first one of the year. Welcome back once again. And I'm really excited to kick off our season this year. Those of you who have been to our coffee chats, you've heard me do this speech dozens of times. But just if you are new, keep in mind that this coffee chat is not a webinar, okay? It's an interactive open session. We invite our entire network. So you will have a wide variety of folks here from all over the world. What does that mean? That means that we invite you to open up your mic, to open your cameras, to participate actively. We always say the more you put in to these sessions, the more you get out of them. We also ask you to be, of course, respectful and keep in mind your comments like you would in any in-person event, right? You can have competitors, investors, journalists in here. And so, everything is fair game. Yes, so please, the couple ways you can get involved, you are free to just jump in, right? If you see an opening and you want to make a comment or ask a question, just jump in at any time. You can raise your hand, you can put a question in the chat and we'll call on you. There's lots of ways to get involved. Okay, so I'm really thrilled. Today we're going to be discussing the very exciting topic of cross-border payments. And I've invited two very esteemed guest experts in this subject matter to guide us in a discussion today. So first, I want to welcome Daniel Ayala, a industry veteran, one of the most knowledgeable people I know about remittances around the world. Welcome, Danny. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And we've also got Cesar Borrelli on our PCMI side, who is very experienced in banking, fintech, and cross-border payments of all kinds, both P2P and on the B2B side. Welcome, Cesar.
Thank you, Lindsay. Glad to be here.
So before I have just a couple slides to get us kicked off, but Danny, give us a little bit of your background, just help the audience get to know you a little bit before we dive into the discussion.
Yeah, I have about, thank you, Lindsay, and pleasure to be here. Good morning to everyone. If I look a little tired, it's because my plane landed into Medellin, Colombia at 2:30 a.m. And here I am from a WeWork location. So having said that, I've been in the industry for about 32 years, always in payments. So the intersection where technology payments meet, that's where you find me at always. Consumer, half of my career consumer, the other half corporate. And 80% of my efforts really on the international side. Latin America and Asia are the two areas of expertise that I have, and done some work with Europe, but really primarily Latin America, US, Canada, and Asia. Pleasure to be here.
Amazing. Thank you, Danny. And Cesar, you're still relatively new to PCMI, so why don't you give a little intro as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it has been 9 months already, so time is going by fast. But yeah, I think Cesar Borrelli, I'm based in São Paulo, Brazil. My background goes to a lot around fintech and bank. I would say the first part of my career worked for several banks across treasury management, product and sales, covering a number of middle market, corporate, and institutional clients as well. And the second part would be more focused on fintech, work for cross-border payments, cross-border e-commerce, and also digital banking. So I'm glad to be here.
Terrific. Terrific. Well, thank you guys. And we're going to have a terrific discussion today. Before we get into that, I just want to set the stage with a couple of slides here. Last week, I was presenting in London at the Finovate Europe event, and I was giving a talk on, what they called a brave new world. developments and evolutions of cross-border payments. And the reason we kicked off this year with a discussion around cross-border is because I think it is the topic that we are most asked about in the past 6 months. Almost all of our discussions with clients, with prospects, with our network somehow comes back to cross-border, whether it is related to wholesale B2B money movement or P2P remittances and everything in between. We're seeing this general convergence, remittances moving more into the payments and banking landscape, banks becoming renewed, having a renewed place with all these different rails popping up that depend on bank accounts, and just an increasingly complex environment. And so, you know, what started off being, when I joined the payments industry more than 10 years ago, it's kind of SWIFT and the MTOs. We now have a hugely diverse and complex web of fintechs, of MTOs, of card networks, of now domestic RTP schemes, developing global connectivity. We've got crypto, we've got stable coins, we've got CBDCs. And so it's becoming increasingly difficult to understand how to compete, how to make money, and how to survive in the long term. And just one more note here is that most of you guys come from Latin America. You've seen us grow from AMI into PCMI. We turned officially 1 year just in December of last year in our global expansion. And so we are still, our audience is still America's focus, and these conversations are still going to have a strong Latin America focus, but we're bringing in, we're increasingly bringing in global perspectives, global voices, global examples to enrich how we see Latin America and start to make those connections at a global level. So this is just to say things are very complicated, and we want to help provide some clarity and hopefully give you some new insights around this industry. And so, you know, one not new development, this is not new by any stretch of the imagination. However, it's becoming more top of mind as we are coming to the end of the coexistence period, right, of this ISO 20022 migration. This has been in the works for over 10 years, but what this is SWIFT transactions globally moving to a new standard of messaging, which is intended to be fully enabled by 2025. This has been in the works again for over a decade. The large banks around the world have been making major upgrades and investments in getting onto this ISO 20022 standard. And I just read a stat that it's estimated that about 80% of the 14,000 financial institutions connected to SWIFT will be ISO ready by the end of 2025, right? The end of next year. And so what this is intended to do is to make SWIFT payments faster, make them more seamless, remove friction, and also have more enriched data that helps institutions understand cross-border flows and be more prepared to compete more aggressively in this space. So this is one aspect that's making SWIFT potentially and theoretically more competitive in an environment where SWIFT is getting attacked from all angles, something that we will discuss a little bit today, right? At the same time, another trend that we're watching very closely is the linkages of domestic RTP schemes, right? This is most advanced in Asia, where we see already linkages between Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and UPI India. These regional clusters that are being used primarily for P2P and for e-commerce, but for increasingly more complex use cases and just growing in scale and really showing a path forward for the rest of the world. We've heard discussion and mention of PIX International, which we'll also discuss a little bit today, which would be kind of following in the footsteps of these regional schemes, becoming an alternative to SWIFT and an alternative to other remitters and cross-border payment networks. And then kind of finally, another angle here is that at the same time, we have the Bank of International Settlement and Project Nexus also trying to enable cluster-based or regional-based cross-border payments as an alternative to SWIFT, as an alternative to existing rails. leveraging existing local infrastructure and creating those cross-border linkages. So there's this kind of global trend of sub-regional connectivity to improve money movement in certain regions. And so we've got these kind of three major trends happening around the world that are adding a new competitive element to cross-border payments, something that is not fully understood. We don't know what the impact will be. We don't know even what the scale or penetration of these are yet. And so we're going to start our conversation today looking at these, but our conversation is probably going to go in multiple different directions. And you guys are welcome once again to jump in, ask questions, and also make comments at any time. So let's start off. Cesar, you just actually published an article on Project Nexus. So can you just give us a little bit of detail? What is this? Why does this exist? And what are the implications of it so far? Are we in very early days? Is this already live? Can you just give us a little bit more context?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Lindsay. This is a topic that I'm deeply passionate, because I think in over probably 20 years in the industry, I think this has the potential to disrupt the industry. I guess I think it is something that can fundamentally change the landscape, not only from a user perspective, but as I like to say, as like creating new rails for further innovation, right? So I think to setting up new standards and new rails that will eventually allow further innovation. So the initiative was actually led by the Bank of International Settlements, the BIS, which is an organization that is actually owned and managed by a number of central banks across the globe. This particular initiative was created by their Singapore, the BIS Singapore led. So they are heading that, and I think the idea behind Project Nexus was to create a framework to facilitate those linkages, right? So it's not the idea of the BIS to be a clearinghouse or like a settlement agent or even to replace SWIFT, but to create a framework and standards that will facilitate countries to adopt the project, right? To embrace the project. So they have created basically like the roles within the domestic RTPs, and then kind of like the gateways, the FX providers, and the standard documentation. So new entrants can more easily integrate into the existing framework. So that's their idea, right? And I think that they like you said, they had a proof of concept with a few countries. I think it has been successful. A lot of learnings came out of this as well. So I think the first goal is, I think, to promote especially P2P transactions, and for the more relevant corridors. So when you talk about Asia and those 5 markets, the flows are significant across each other. So I think that was the main initial goal with the concept. They will expand that into P2B and B2P as well, so that will be allowed. I think B2B, technically speaking, it could happen for B2B, but the volumes are much higher, and the central banks will need to have very different liquidity levels and risk levels to operate within that scale. And that's actually one of the learnings as well, right? So when you get the RTP in one country, you have some payment limitations that you don't have in a different country. So when you start like linking those different RTPs, you end up not only from a technical standpoint, having the complexities across different countries, but you have different business rules, right? You have different compliance screening and anti-money laundering screening. So I would say it's very promising. I like the project. I like the idea. But also, like the article said, and you have here as well, it's going to be really challenging to level set all the operational burden and the business rules that you have within its scheme.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question on this. Is this connecting the back-end systems and central bank systems and banking systems together? That's what this is. I'm obviously asked to include that. Does it also include the front-end technology? In other words, how easy is it for someone in Malaysia who has a mobile wallet account send money to someone in Thailand who has a bank account? Is that easy?
Yeah. So I think the idea behind Nexus is it's not going to be a consumer facing brand. You're not going to have a Nexus app. They're not going to be involved in the flow other than the technology itself, other than to facilitate the technology. So all the rules that you have applicable to domestic RTPs, they will be kept. So if let's say Brazil, right, that it's closer to heart. So in Brazil, the regulation allows banks and non-banks to operate PIX, right? So they will honor that. So if you have a digital wallet in Brazil, you can use that wallet to fund your PIX, your transaction that will originate as a PIX, but will settle as UPI in India, right? And then if in India happens that you can also have the same structure of having the digital wallets and they can participate on UPI, but you might have a country where the real-time payment is exclusive for banks, right? For like if you're sending money to FedNow and through FedNow in the US to a specific bank in the US, so they will honor like that domestic governance. So you can have the wallet if the country allows the wallet to participate in the instant payment scheme, or not, right? So it's
okay, but it's difficult to actually figure out how to identify the destination.
Go ahead, Nick.
Sorry, it's difficult to identify the destination if you run different systems. I mean, PIX is really an amazing system because it's already a single identifier across every bank, every mobile wallet. UPI doesn't have PIX. Indonesia, they don't have PIX. So you're now talking about connecting an account in the PIX structure with an account in another system. How do you do that if I'm sending the money? I mean, you already said that you're not dealing with the front end and the authorization level, but that's the question. Like, how do we actually get to use this?
Yeah.
So I think the main one of the main things that the BIS will try to do is actually to when they connect those two RTP systems, they will try to level set the rules across them, right? So if someone is sending funds into Brazil, you can use the proxy, right? They have like what they call, I think, proxy provider or something. But you can, like, if you select Brazil and you're sending money from the US into Brazil, then you might have all those different ways that you can send that to a person using PIX, right? You can have their tax ID, you can have their phone number, you can have their email. So they will facilitate that, at least the understanding of the framework and how to document that, like all the handles that people can use to actually send money. So it's I think that has a good potential.
I think what's key about Nexus is that you got the Monetary Authority of Singapore 100% behind it, and they're really trying to position themselves as sort of the clearing center of the region after the changes that have taken place in Hong Kong over the last 10 years or so. So it is becoming the monetary center of the region, and as a result, MAS is really in to become kind of a regional clearinghouse on the back end. And all the central banks in the region are actually very much interested in seeing faster payments flowing throughout the region because it's in the best interest of the local economy. So if you look at why are they doing this, it's because you got a significant flow of people between these regions exchanging value, and today it can take days, and it's prone to issues in terms of delays and also sending funds to the wrong individual inadvertently, that sort of thing. So from that perspective, they're solving a key issue. I think the greater opportunity for the central banks here is also to ensure they remain relevant. So I think there's two other projects that apply here. Project Mandala, which is something else that BIS has been working on prior to this, which focuses around the exchange of information about individuals to make the process less prone to friction and allow the regulatory requirements of each country to be properly addressed and be able to enable truly faster payments without the slowdown of compliance for each country. So I think they're on to something really good. And quite frankly, the perception of banks in the region is very positive right now. So I think something good will come out of that. Banks do what they do best, which is protect themselves from fraud. And so the front ends will be able to address some of that. And some of the challenges that the compliance teams have is being able to ensure they know enough about the beneficiary when they're sending money to a phone number or an email, right? I think they're gonna ensure that gets taken care of versus today's workarounds, which are not 100% tight. So I think that's kind of what we're gonna see with this based on the engagement that BIS has here and the MAS has.
I think we would be amiss if we didn't talk here also about the digital aspects of the cross-border CDBC between Singapore and China also, because that is the first of its kind, what we've seen globally, and it is a game changer.
Absolutely agree. I mean, you got Project Nexus as well, which is the CBDC tie-ups between banks, also a BIS initiative. So I think when you put all these together, I was talking to Lindsay and Cesar before the call. It's my definition being a payments nerd of Nirvana, right? When you combine those three elements, CBDCs, what these guys are working on with this Project Nexus, and some of the end game of Mandala, I think you see a very attractive ecosystem in which things would be much better. How we get there, difficult, because you deal with different jurisdictions, different compliance approaches, and you have to have the banks buying and a regional play for it to happen. But the exchange of value between consumers in these regions is vast, and so it's a problem that needs to be solved, and needs to be solved, ensuring transparency, ensuring security, and strong compliance controls. When you look at what aggregators do today in other parts of the world, they're trying to imitate this by allowing faster payments, but they're not doing it through a standardized approach. This is going to create a global standard.
So Danny, I want to ask you, both you and Cesar and anyone else who wants to jump in, it seems like the way I understand this is putting banks back in the center of cross-border payments, of retail level cross-border payments. They've kind of always been in the middle of wholesale, but on the retail side, there's been all this competition over the last 10 years from different fintechs, wallets, Visa, MasterCard. But this seems like it places banks back in the center, making it easier for customers to use their bank to send a payment. How do you see, is that a fair observation? How do you see this impacting fintechs who are active in this space?
So I think from and I'll take the perspective of banks in the region. Let's start with the Americas. In the US and Canada, banks have really played more of a back-end role, right? At the end of the day, ultimately you need access to the payment system. So whether you're an aggregator, a remittance company, a payments company, or a smaller non-bank financial institution, at the end of the day, you settle through a bank. So the banks have been playing a role always, and they've always been central, but on the back end, not very visible, with a few exceptions in the US that have really high-speed, fully transparent payment systems and capabilities. When you look at Asia, you see banks like DBS really taking an amazing proactive approach in being both on the back end and the front end of P2P cross-border transactions. And for only one reason, I mean, more than 80% of the population in Singapore came from somewhere else, and they're sending money somewhere else. So it makes absolute sense for that to be the case. There's other obvious examples and opportunities in places like the UAE, where you got about 87% of the population being from somewhere else, right? But I think what this does, to answer your question directly, is it actually provides an opportunity for the banks to play a stronger role on the front end. I think you still find some banks that don't want to take part on the front end of the transaction, that they see themselves more as a value provider, whether it's on the FX side, on the settlement side, and providing all their compliance expertise to the process. whereas others will take a very proactive front-end approach. Yeah, I think in the US, banks kind of took a backseat to faster P2P payments until Venmo came out with their high-speed P2P process, and banks had to kind of reinvent the wheel and offer sell. So I think you might see some of that happening.
Can I jump in
of what
here?
we're seeing here, you're seeing a shift in activity.
Can I jump in
Go
here?
ahead, Nick. Yeah.
An observation, most of the banks in the West now, they really don't care about the consumer. They care about business accounts. That's their real money maker. They'll do the consumer, but they're not going to jump over hurdles for them. They'll do whatever their business accounts want though. So it's a matter of focus of what they are. That's why you've got the rise of alternatives, and especially in other countries, you've got mobile wallets and other fintechs. And in the US, you've got credit unions. They're filling in the gaps because the big banks really don't want to deal with that anymore. They won't say that, of course, but that's really where they are.
No, that makes sense. I think,
yeah.
Danny, we're going to say something.
I would beg to disagree. Actually, I think in the US, the concentration on consumer deposits with large banks, the top 5, is still very significant. Maybe it's different in Europe, but in the US, it's still, the critical mass is pretty high. Case in point, Chase, consumer deposits growth over the last 4 years is probably the highest in the industry. I do think, fintechs have carved a lot of space into the consumer deposit side and consumer payments. But at the end of the day, when you look at traditional consumer banks in the US, Bank of America, Chase, Wells Fargo, just between those 3, you got probably well over 60% of consumer deposits covered there.
There's a question from
I've worked for
Mazen.
most
Do you
of them,
want to
so I
jump
know
in?
how they think internally.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm sorry, but I would like to have some technical little bit questions and little bit of business regarding the Nexus project. So I was included in one of the projects before, and we were making MOI regarding this one. And my question is what is the settlement time for a happy scenario for a Nexus transaction has been processed from Philippines or Singapore banks from end to end? And second question is how did you guys overcome the sanction screening between the banks before it has been settlement in their RTGS systems, like a bank in Singapore when he's making a sanction screening first, and then the other bank in, let's say, in Italy, where he's making the sanction screening? How did you overcome this situation actually within the time period of like 10 seconds or the 15 seconds, which is normally happening for an instant payment transaction? Third, did you guys make a connection between this one to make it survive or to make it working? Did you guys make it through a Swift AGI services, or did you guys make it through a private network? This is my third. Sorry, I make it long.
No problem.
So my fourth and my last question, actually, who's handling the storage of the CAS, of the central addressing schemes of every bank? Sorry, from every central bank point of view, does Nexus itself is having the access to this CAS, the central addressing scheme, like the data to process, to pick up the phone number or the IBAN to link it to the phone number, or we're just sending it through an API before the transaction itself has been processed? Sorry, I make it long, guys, but I would like to have an answer if you guys have. Thank you so much.
I can take that. Well, a lot of questions, a lot of questions. we might have the same question, but I mean, taking some of them. So the goal is to process a transaction in a maximum of 60 seconds. So 60 seconds is the goal when connecting, linking those RTPs. There is still a lot of uncertainty between the screening criteria. Of course, the idea of the project, it is to comply with all those multilateral jurisdictions. So when you're moving money from one country to the other, you should comply with local regulations in one market and the other. So there are specific cases that they are even like creating a figure of request for information. So if the receiving party doesn't feel comfortable about receiving a specific transaction, they could actually initiate that RFI process to gather more information and then deciding if they will decline or accept the transaction. So there is still a lot in there, especially with regards to the transaction monitoring. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of the project and of the speed, right? Because one thing is RTPs in general, even when we talk domestically, they are not they haven't yet figured out how to replace credit cards with regards to disputes, chargebacks, and all those things. And when you take that at an international level, that becomes worse, right? And then you have 2 different countries, and you can claim funds between countries. You have FX rates, you have fluctuation. So it's a very challenging topic. I don't think they have all the answers yet. They're still finding out a lot of the issues and how to come across those issues. What Nexus is trying to do is basically to orchestrate those transactions and those different RTPs. So they're not going to be part of the funds flow. They're not going to receive funds. They're not going to have a say on the transaction if they accept or if they reject the transaction. They are actually a combination of they create the technology, or they create the framework for those for this technology to flow. So they create the figure of the gateways. They have the one figure of you mentioned that I think it's called the settlement account. So the settlement account will be provided by an FX provider. So for a specific transaction, if there's a transaction happening from Singapore to Malaysia, there might be a number of FX providers that will be interested in that transaction, and they can provide the rates in the back end. Then as a consumer, you can pick the rate. And you can make the transaction. That specific FX provider will have settlement accounts in both markets, so they can provide the liquidity to at the same time receive your payment from the domestic RTP into that settlement account, and then converting that overseas and sending funds overseas from that Destiny settlement account to your Destiny bank account or wallet in that market. So they will do that. So the BIS won't do a Nexus. They won't do anything on the settlement or even like you said, the proxy. They will facilitate the documentation between the countries, so they can understand and they can have access to kind of like copies of the databases and the proxy, and how to orchestrate that transaction and to pull information from a proxy database. But they won't be part of the flow. So
Okay.
I don't know
Can I jump?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I jump in on this, because you brought up some very interesting points on that. It seems to me that what is needed is sort of like a universal, across all regions, a universal way of recognizing a destination. We have a model of that already. It's the card rails. You can use your credit card in any country in the world where it can be accepted. That obviously doesn't work for these. Those rails don't work for these. But if there was a universal rail as sort of like a light layer that lays on top of all these other systems, then you could use it across the world. You could use it everywhere. That is what at a technical level, I can build that. That is, for those that don't know who I am, I'm a super geek in the infrastructure world. I'm one of, if not the top person in. I built Visa's global debit card system in 1996 because they couldn't do it themselves. They brought me in to do it for them. I've written data security standards for the payment industry. I've pretty much done everything you can in this industry. I sort of wrote the book for it as well. I can build that light layer that lays on top of all these regional systems, so that anybody that puts the banks and the mobile wallets right in the center of it, the same way that Visa and MasterCard does. And now it makes a universal means of transacting with anyone, anywhere in the world, and can include dispute resolution, chargebacks, all that other paraphernalia as well, because that's the world I'm from. I built half the infrastructure we use in the card rails in the West here. Maybe not quite true, but not too far from it.
So is that layer being built? Is that user experience or that layer that you're just talking about, Nick? I mean, like you said, with Pix, there's a universal UX and there's a central database of users and aliases. Is that currently being built? Is that something
Sort of. So where it is right now is I've got a country that wants to be first, but it's too small to build this infrastructure. What I'm doing is I'm getting responses. I'm actually proposing to the state of California right now that they build a mobile wallet for the 3+ million undocumented in the state that can't get bank accounts. And once the whole goal of what I'm doing, because you have a little bit of an idea of what my goals are with the company that I'm doing, the goal is that once that mobile wallet for the undocumented is constructed, now you have international remittances to Latin America because they all have families south of the border. So I can build the infrastructure. That's the world I'm from.
right?
And I was thinking, if I can get those 3 million people in California that are earning $100 billion a year, they've been here for 20 years. They've got families, houses, cars, phones, and they do everything in cash. They get paid with a check and they go to the check cashing companies, and then they use Western Union to send it south of the border. I can build the infrastructure. On a technical level, I can build all of that. The question is there enough desire for it? And so if there is, I can do it.
I think that's the point.
I have patents. I have all of that stuff ready to go. I've got running prototypes. I've got it all ready to go. I'm just not a very good salesperson.
Yeah, but I think that's the point. I think we are getting to a world where we are kind of like marching backwards within globalization, right? So you had in the past, you had Citibank, you had all those large banks, you had Visa, you had Master. They had the technical skill, and I think all the countries and governments, they were open for new technology, and they wanted that to happen. But that has scaled back. I think like Citibank has, I don't even know how many markets they have retail bank outside of the US today. Like all those like larger companies that were expanding globally, they are kind of like focusing on a specific market, a specific region. And I think the same happens with like RTP. I think governments are actually very proud of developing that in-house. And I don't know if they want someone else to be on top of that, or I don't know if I mean, I think the value proposition of Nexus, I think it's interesting for governments because it gives them the right to operate as they are. It's just a connection between several RTPs, right? So if you have a good commerce or trade relationship within those two markets, and they agree on the screening criteria, they are comfortable with the fraud and the risk level across all those markets, I think they would be glad to connect those RTPs. But I don't know if they want to have someone on top orchestrating the whole thing, like a third party, like a new Visa, a new Master. I don't know if the markets want that. You have all those different networks, local networks, right? In India, you have the local branded scheme. Then in Vietnam, you have a local branded schemes. So yeah.
And I think just to add to that, there are rails in place that could solve all of these. I mean, some of them have been around for a long time, and some of them have the scale capacity in place already to be able to facilitate something like this. I agree 100% with that. The challenge comes in the execution and the go-to-market approach, because most of these payment systems are used to the healthy revenue streams associated with their existing business models, and they often don't want to jeopardize that in exchange for a much lower revenue element. So, you could look at SWIFT, you could look at Visa, Rails, MasterCard, and so forth, and they are outstanding. But I think the opportunity they have is to kind of reinvent their business model as it relates to this type of transaction. So, you know, if you look at card model, they're still using the interchange model, which for a P2P transaction, a percentage of the transaction comes in at a hefty price. And I think that's where, you know, where you see limited usage and application of that on the send side. On the receive side, it's most welcome, I think. And I think that's the challenge you run into. When you look at Swift rails, it's the same issue. It's the banks have been used to allowing transactions to take T+1, T+2. There's float to be made, and also there's Swift commissions. It's not so much the Swift commission, it's what banks traditionally have charged for a traditional wire transfer, which gives rise to companies like a Remitly or a Zoom before Remitly, where, you know, they're able to sort of create their own private network using very similar payment technologies to what these folks use, but creating their own private network, which it's great, but it's very expensive to build and be able to have a very different business model, which is what consumer remittances are all about. I mean, you know, when you have a new entrant in a matter of 10 years go from zero to close to $8.5 billion in value coming out of the US, that tells you that people are looking for faster, better, cheaper, and more transparent. And that's what the established entities are having a difficult time doing. I think what BIS is doing is creating a nice rule book and guidelines. And what you'll see is either central banks and large regional hubs jumping on it and trying to build a multilateral system, or you'll find private industry players, which today exist. You know, it's probably about 6 or 7 aggregators around the world that move billions of dollars, not very well known because they operate behind remittance companies and P2P companies, but they're out there and they're moving billions of dollars across the board, taking the part of what Swift could be doing, what Visa rails could be doing, but with a very different business model. So the challenge is that it's the business model.
Business model.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Danny, I want to just transition a bit, because one trend that we're seeing is that remittances, P2P payments are kind of converging with the rest of the payments industry, right? You've got all of these different payments players now wanting a piece of P2P. But another thing that is occurring is that fees are coming down. It's getting more competitive. It's harder to make that into a business. And so one area of cross-border payments that we see exploding, or at least getting so much attention, is mass disbursements, right? Payouts, digital payouts. And really that's a payment to a consumer or someone who is a sole proprietor, a gig economy worker, a freelancer, or whatever, from a corporate. And so what can we say about this trend? I guess I have kind of 2 questions. One is, you know, Danny, in a previous conversation, you mentioned that corporates are hunting for solutions, right, to make mass disbursements faster, cheaper, better. And so my question is kind of, why are they hunting for this? There's many solutions out there. What's their challenge, and, you know, what are they truly trying to solve? And then secondly, there's all of these, almost every payments company in the world now, if you're moving money from Adyen, Rapid, Nuvei, dLocal, they're moving from pay-ins to this payout space. And so how do they differentiate among themselves? What makes one better than the other? Is there truly a differentiation? Love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, definitely a big trend right now. So P2P was kind of the driver on cross-border in terms of scale and size, right? And demand for high speed. So lots of transactions, low value, under $3,000 typically, but expecting, you know, you hit send and the money is available in minutes. And that's not just a Western Union play. It's just about everyone that plays in the remittance space is able to do that. Out comes Uber and Grab and, you know, the many gig type economy companies, and they scale globally very quickly. And a key need comes up, which is the ability to pay people immediately on the same day basis. You know, an Uber driver, I remember about 15 years ago being at a at a large scale Swift conference at Sibos somewhere in Europe, and we met with Uber, and they said, we want real time, fast payments to these 22 countries in 6 months, including being able to allow people to get paid in cash and pick up their funds. These are drivers, they need the money today. They can't wait a week to get paid. They want to get paid the day they did the work. As a bank sort of scratch your head and say, it's impossible, we can't do that ourselves, we need help. Then they go on to other companies, a company that doesn't exist anymore, they were acquired, it was Earthport. They tried to go at it, and it's been more than 10 years, so I can talk about it. Failed to do it. I mean, it took him about 4 months to figure out Earthport couldn't do it. That was a big promise there. There were other players that tried to do it until Uber decided to go ahead and kind of, patch together a bunch of providers together, including banks, including remittance companies, and including new payment companies being set up exclusively for Uber. You fast track to today, and what you have is, if you talk to any bank in the Americas or Asia, they would tell you that the cross-border groups are now looking at cross-border to consumers, not just from consumer, but also from corporate. And so definitely there is a trend of this, and it's not just the large corporates, but also mid-sized and small-sized companies saying, I have a call center in Medellin, Colombia. I got 32 people. I'm not going to set up a company there. I need someone to help me. And that's where some of these companies that you mentioned come into play. So definitely that's getting significant traction. I think what you're going to find is that this will be figured out pretty well, not by the banks, but by the fintechs. And that's what we're seeing today. And the banks, as they become more comfortable, they'll start streamlining their capabilities to be able to service these. I've had visibility to at least 2 major bank inquiries into the industry in the last 2 years, and they were all about large-scale mass payment solutions from US to 10, 15, 20 countries around the world. And they were asking, I want to be able to pay real time into a wallet. I want to be able to pay real time into a bank account. And they were not sending these to other banks. They were sending to large-scale aggregators that service remittance companies today. So I think that's kind of an aha moment, right? That you're seeing major banks realizing that they want to play. And to your point, Nick, I mean, I think the banks are definitely looking for the right rails, and that's where you find a Visa Direct trying to position itself. You find a MasterCard Send trying to position themselves, because that's sort of where you say you're able to kind of mix the corporate side of the bank with the consumer side of the bank. So definitely a lot of traction there, and a change in how people behave, not only in inbound, but also outbound. So that's the other side is, people in Colombia buying from e-commerce sites in Brazil and Mexico, right? And expecting to be able to settle payment very quickly so they can get access to the goods being shipped to them.
Perfect. I mean, the banks hold the relationships with the corporates, right? It's difficult for a fintech to go and sell directly to a corporate. So it makes sense that they're selling into banks that then turn around and provide that solution to their customers. Cesar, how do you see Nexus or any other similar scheme playing a role in mass disbursements? Is it like just the last mile delivery method? Do you see, how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I think technically speaking, it could help those transfers. It could, the same way as the domestic RTP schemes are growing the B2C use cases. I think that can be mirrored. Of course, each market is at a different stage. Most markets are still heavily focused on P2P. But for example, in Brazil, P2B and even person to business and business to person has been growing very fast. So I think it could help those movements. The one thing is, I don't know yeah, I don't know how fast that's going to happen. I think it's I think
Yeah.
on the P2P side, it's more clear. But then when you get
Yeah.
to those like larger companies, like Danny said, I think the all those technology platforms, they have grown, and as a technology platform, you cannot grow overhead the same way you grow revenue and clients. So one of their big drivers is expansion, right? So Uber is expanding,
Yeah.
Booking is expansion. So all of that has driven those like global payouts. And the first thing that they do, they go to Citibank, Bank of America, JP Morgan, say, I need to pay those people in those markets. Can you work with me on those markets? And sometimes they say yes, especially for the freely convertible currencies, like sending funds from the US to Europe, Europe to US, UK, Australia. That's pretty easy, right? I mean, they don't need a fintech to do that. I think the fintechs have emerged for the more restricted currencies. If you see, when you talk about restricted currencies, you usually have the component of the sender and the receiver. And I think the most successful brands within those restricted markets are probably PayPal and Payoneer. And because they understand that, right? They understand that they even though they are a B2B company, they need to create this B2C branding, so people are familiar, people can get onboarded, people trust them. And I think that's where large banks, especially the ones, like I said, most of the global banks are kind of like getting heavily focused on the wholesale. They're not retail banks everywhere. So they don't have the appetite to work with individuals like outside of their home market for most of those banks. And I think that's where
I think that's a great insight,
opportunity.
Cesar. And those two are very well positioned, PayPal and Payoneer, and they've invested in that. You know, Pedro asks the age-old question, fintechs, should they integrate with existing local payment infrastructure or start a new rail, right? That's the timeless, you know, basically a closed loop or an open loop system. I think there's probably a lot of differing opinions on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say that was the promise of blockchain companies like Ripple, right? That was what they were aiming to do when they started. And because of the times with crypto last year, I think things kind of slowed down for those types of efforts. But there's still a greenfield opportunity for fintechs to get into that space. And I don't think there's a clear lead right now. There's a significant opportunity. It'll take deep pockets and probably a bit of engagement between banks and large corporates to make the push and make the effort to make it happen. You know, we look in the US and domestically, you know, for insurance payments after a disaster, they in the old days, they used to cut checks to all these people being hit. And now there's new ways to do it. And there's companies that are not banks that have done a good job at doing things like this. And I look at them and say, you know, they're really well positioned to take their business model and take it international. It's a company out there called, I think, Ingo Money, where they actually have become really good at doing, you know, massive payment volumes into consumers for situations like that. There's probably at least 2 or 3 others doing similar things in the US, and corporates are choosing to use them over banks because they're able to provide a very simple API that, you know, works fairly quick and able to identify and ensure that they're getting the money to the right individual, which is the other key element here, is avoiding the fraud side, right?
Awesome. So we're almost out of time. I do want to I have one last question for the group. Before I do that, I do want to go ahead and launch a very quick poll. We have a lot of new people who have never been in a coffee chat before, I think from many parts of the world. And I would just like to give you guys the opportunity to get in touch with us. We have if you're curious about getting in touch with myself at PCMI or with Cesar or even Danny, or anyone you met here at the coffee chat, please let us know. We'll be happy to reach out, just learn about you, talk about these trends. We can also just talk about how PCMI might be able to help you. So I'm just going to leave this up for about a minute before we close out. But my last question is, you know, Cesar, how do you see this, especially the trend of Nexus, these kind of sub-regional schemes, how do you see that impacting Latin America? Right, there's a big discussion about PIX International. I don't think there's a lot of clarity around that yet. Do you see that as moving forward? Do you see some other player coming up and solving for intra-regional payments? How do you see that playing out in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think I mean, one thing that I know for sure, I think those things will evolve. I don't know if Nexus will address all the challenges, but you know, as we had seen before with RTP and all those like closed loop schemes, I think you're going to end up seeing some like initiatives. You already can pay with PIX, for example, in several other countries in Latin America, and that's backed by fintechs, that's backed by banks, and so I think those initiatives will grow either like through third party or like some like separate agreements, like you're seeing like there's another initiative in the Nordics, there's an initiative in the Arabic speaking countries. So I think you're gonna see all those different initiatives. I don't think Nexus will be the only one. So that's gonna grow for sure. I think I think Brazil the Central Bank of Brazil has been very active on trying to pursue those relationships and bilateral agreements. The G20 had a meeting here, I think within the last couple of weeks, and a lot has been said around PIX International as well. So yeah, I don't think we're gonna have one answer to that. I don't think Nexus will be the only project. It can be Nexus for integrating PIX into Asia, but it can be also, they can have a Mercosur initiative to do that at a regional level.
Got it. Well, thank you both, Danny and Cesar, for sharing with us today. A super fascinating and engaging discussion. I know we only scratched the surface. I want to invite all of you to bookmark April 8th. We'll be back to continue this discussion, most likely with a discussion of ISO 20022. We're still confirming some speakers and confirming the topic, but I believe we will continue on this path of cross-border payments. And I know there were a lot of comments in the chat that we weren't able to get to, some especially around CBDCs, which warrants its own conversation. So I think we'll definitely schedule that and dive deep into that topic. So thank you all for joining. It was great to see all of you back here, and we will see you back in about a month. So, you know, take some notes, come back to us with your insights, and we'll pick it up in April.